Well, among the bucket list hikes in Nova Scotia, Money Point. At the northern tip of Nova Scotia, it takes you along mountain plateaus and along a coastline that is spectacular on a sunny day or even on a foggy day. It's not an easy hike, but it's well worth it. And it's where my walkabout finds me today. This is the northern tip of Cape Breton. When I reach the end of this hike, it's pretty much as far as you can go in Nova Scotia, headed north. The nearest communities are Dingwall, South Harbour, and Bay St. Lawrence. None are very big. For example, Dingwall is home to 600 people, and it's the largest of the three. The Mi'kmaq call Cape North Canuck, which means highest mountain. This is a part of the province where serious outdoor enthusiasts flock. North of the Cabot Trail and of the Cape Breton Highlands National Park, this area includes beautiful beaches and amazing opportunities for whale and seabird watching, mountain biking, hunting, fishing, and of course, hiking. You know, if you look on just about any mapping software, it will show this road, the 614 road, and the Money Point road as drivable, pretty well all the way to the Cape North Lighthouse. Don't be fooled, it's not. Most of this road is impassable by the majority of vehicles, and it will become tougher and tougher and tougher to the point where it's even a challenge for ATVs. Now here's something you can file in the only in Cape Breton section. Locally, you'll hear some people, especially older people, talk about going down north. Of course, on any map with north oriented up, it would really be up north, not down. Well, this is the end of the 614 road, and no, I don't know why it's called the 614 road. It's where we meet the Money Point road. Now, this road in that direction, which I'm going to be taking, goes to the Cape North Lighthouse, and that direction goes to Bay St. Lawrence. You can actually start this hike from either the end of the Money Point road in Bay St. Lawrence or where I started near the cell towers on the 614. It is about the same distance, but it's a little bit more difficult to take the Money Point road from the beginning because it requires climbing up to the plateau I'm on. So you get a hill coming up, across the plateau, and a hill going down, and the same thing in reverse. The way I chose at least skips one of those hills. The Money Point Road was built at one point as an access to the lighthouse down on the shore, which I'll reach later on. The other end in Bay St. Lawrence is a popular whale watching and hiking destination. It was founded, like much of this area, Victoria County, by Scottish immigrants. Those immigrants came primarily from the Scottish mainland and Western Islands, with a few others coming from England and Ireland. It was isolated living. There were few, if any, roads to speak of for a long time, in some places right into the 20th century. So travel was by ship along the coast, by canoe in the rivers, and occasionally informal trails passing through the mountains. The 1818 census didn't even count people in this county, it was so isolated. But written accounts of the time say no more than 100 families lived between Cape North, close to where I am now, and Big Bredor Lake. 40 years later, a report in December of 1861 talked about the continued isolation in this part of Cape Breton, noting that settlers longed for fairs or farmers markets where cattle and seed could be traded and culture celebrated. Well, I've made it across the plateau with a few ups and downs, and now it's time for the descent, the long descent, to the coast. You know, this may not look like much of a road these days, but when the lighthouse, the Cape North Lighthouse, was operational, vehicles would travel up and down this road. And perhaps more impressively, when the lighthouse was decommissioned in 1980, trucks actually hauled that lighthouse in sections, dragged by bulldozers, up this road and out. The top of the lighthouse even traveled up this road on a crane. Now, I somehow don't think you'd be driving much of anything up what's left of the road these days. But at the time, it took 3 weeks to disassemble and move the lighthouse to Dartmouth's Coast Guard Station, where it was prepared and ultimately shipped to Ottawa, where it remains on display at the Canada Science and Technology Museum. Well, I'm now on a 400-meter decline from the highest point that I was at. This will be about 1.5 kilometers of hiking to get to the bottom, and the footing is a little sketchy. Well, this waterfall comes down off the mountain. It's not running at full force at the moment, but there's enough water in there if you needed to fill your drinking containers. And this is your last opportunity to get fresh water before you hit the coast. And of course, at the coast, it's all salt water, so now it's the chance. Especially if you're traveling with a dog, you also want to be sure to fill up so that everybody stays well hydrated. Well, this is the coastal portion of the Money Point hike. In the distance there's a herd of seals. Now, sometimes there's actually herds of horses down here, although they say this year those horses haven't been around. They're privately owned, they're not wild horses. After the break, I'm gonna be headed along Money Point, along the coastline to the Cape North Lighthouse.
Oh, come on, won't you be mine? Feel the sunshine.
I'm on the Money Point Trail in northern Cape Breton. Now, I've made it down off the plateau, the top of the mountain, to the coast, where I'm watching the seals play. The lighthouse that I'm here to see, the Cape North Lighthouse, is about 1.5 kilometers that way along the coast, and that's where I'm headed. But first, it's important to talk about the area behind me and how Money Point got its name. Almost 10,000 shipwrecks have been found along the coast of Nova Scotia. Undoubtedly, there are many more. At least 200 have wrecked off this point over the past 300 years. The story goes that a ship carrying pay for a garrison in Quebec was lost at sea off this shore. The name Money Point is said to have come about, about 100 years ago, when people said you could put tar at the end of a stick and pick up gold and silver coins along the shoreline. It's a bit like the tales of putting a basket in the water and coming up with it full of cod, almost certainly somewhat exaggerated. But some people say gold and silver coins are still occasionally found along this shoreline. You know, that ship that wrecked was probably the Africaine in 1843, although that isn't certain. That bark had only been launched in 1831, and it was sailing from Dublin to Quebec when it wrecked somewhere between Cheticamp and Aspy Bay. That's a lot of ocean to cover. However, if you dig a little bit deeper, you will find that the crew left a handwritten note. And in that note, they talk about walking for 4 days through the woods and over the mountains to reach Aspy Bay. Now, if they had wrecked near Cheticamp, well, in the 1800s, there were lots of communities up and down that coast. So it seems unlikely they would have come all the way across the highlands to Aspy Bay. So, with a bit of guesswork and a bit of sleuthing, it appears it's the Africaine that led to this being called Money Point. At low tide, you can sometimes see the remnants of a steel wreck in the waters off this coast. But that is not the Africaine. What little remains there is the wreck of the Carita, which was grounded and sunk in 1975. It was an iron ship of over 4,000 tons carrying general cargo. You know, the African was not the only ship to have difficulty along this coast, and so in 1874, the first Cape North lighthouse was constructed. But it wasn't constructed on the location that I'm headed to. Rather, it was constructed a little bit to the south. In fact, I passed the ruins of it as I walked this way. A little over 30 years later, in 1906, a fog alarm building was started, right where the current light is. In those days, large foghorns required an engineer to operate, as they were complex pieces of machinery. They were what is known as diaphones, which were reliable and lasted a long time, but also relied on some extensive knowledge of pipe fitting to operate. For this reason, since a new lighthouse was also being planned anyhow, they included a double dwelling, one for a lighthouse keeper and their family, and one for an engineer and his family to operate the fog alarm. The families established a small farm here, which would provide fresh produce. They also built a school for the children. The school was taught by the parents of the children because, of course, no one else came here except the twice annual supply ships. Beyond that, you were on your own. It would have been a lonely life, but in keeping with the history of life in Cape North generally during the early 1900s. So for most of the time there was a lighthouse here, there was no electricity. The lighthouse keeper had to get up every 4 hours, wind the clockwork mechanism, just so the light would be sure to flash every 5 seconds. There was no road here either until much, much later on. And when they did build a road, they were kind enough to give the lighthouse keeper and his family a Jeep. And that Jeep could take them to Bay St. Lawrence for medical emergencies in theory. But more often than not, they had trouble using it, because what would happen is when they went up that hill that I came down, the engine oil would run to the back of the engine and the vehicle would seize. That hill isn't just tough today, it was tough then too. Commercial electricity wasn't extended to this station until 1973. At the same time, perhaps to facilitate the arrival of electrical poles and installation, the road, such as it was upgraded, though the effect of those upgrades have clearly long passed. These foundations are all that's left to remind us of the people who once lived here, the lighthouse keeper and his family, the engineer and his family, and the buildings, that fog station, the lighthouse itself, the homes and the buildings that would have supported that. The lighthouse has long since been replaced by an automated station that sends out a lonely signal to passing ships. Now that Cape North lighthouse that used to sit here was in fact second-hand. It originally was installed in 1856 at Cape Ray in Newfoundland. And when it was replaced, it was disassembled and brought over here and rebuilt. And of course, Cape Ray wasn't even where it started. It was built as a whole bunch of steel sheets in the UK before being taken to Newfoundland. And then from here, it went to Ottawa. And all this was only possible because it was put together with 800 bolts. You know, I think that lighthouse may very well have been the world's most traveled lighthouse. St. Paul's Island is about 24 kilometers from here, an island called the Graveyard of the Gulf, as it too is home to numerous shipwrecks. It too has traded a manned lighthouse for an automated light. You can sometimes see it from here on a clear day. The island sits on the boundary between the Gulf of St. Lawrence and the Cabot Strait. Beyond that, Cape Ray, on the island of Newfoundland, where the Cape North Lighthouse once stood. That's only 100 kilometers away. You know, we talk about lighthouse keepers as men, and they were, that's what the official record says. But married men were preferred for this job because then their wife could also learn the trade. This was such isolated living that it took everybody living here to man this kind of station. On this hike, you can see just how isolated this location was, and it was far more isolated when this station was operating than it is today. Well, after the break, I am headed to a hike not too far from here that is just as difficult, involves pretty much as much elevation, but it's quite a bit shorter.
Won't you be mine? Feel the sunshine.
Well, they say what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. I am at the base of Theodore Fricker Mountain, and it's a trail that is very steep, but also short, at only about 1.5 kilometers to the summit. And on a day like this, with the opportunity for views over North Harbor and Aspy Bay, it's the perfect place for my walkabout today. This is one of those trails that you start on and you say to yourself, the grade isn't as bad as I thought it would be. But it will get steeper, and just when you think it can't get steeper anymore, it will get steeper yet again. This is a trail that really is as much about the accomplishment of getting to the top as the trail itself. Oh, and if it's clear at the top, it's about the view, which everyone tells me is more than worth the effort to get to the top. It's possible you may not have heard of Theodore Fricker Mountain. The name was only changed in 2007, and the old name, Tenerife, is still in use by those unaware of the change. I mean, in fact, even Tenerife isn't that old, having only come into use in 1975. Why it was called Tenerife is not clear. The Nova Scotia government did a search, but didn't come up with anything conclusive. Now, this is a complete guess on my part, but if you look at a photo of Santa Cruz in Tenerife, there are mountains surrounding a cove with a barrier beach. While Spanish and tropical, it has a similar look to what you see looking down from this peak. In fact, many photos you see of people taken on the top of Theodore Fricker Mountain have a similar structure as the ones you see taken from the mountaintops around Tenerife. On top of that, the name of the bay below the mountain, Aspy, also has Basque Spanish origins. So to me, it all seems to fit. I want to stress, however, that's a complete guess on my part, as I've gone down the road trying to understand the earlier name for this peak and this hike. Tenerife, of course, is the old name. These days, it's called the Theodore Fricker Mountain, and it's been called that since 2007. Now, Theodore Fricker lived next to this mountain, and he guided moose hunting trips up the mountain and in these forests. He died unexpectedly in 2007 of a heart attack. Fricker was 58 when he died, and he was someone who would go hunting to ensure a family that might not have enough food for the winter would have something. He'd go hunt a moose and clean it for them. After he died, his daughter, Jamie Fricker, launched a campaign to have the name of the mountain officially changed. About 500 people signed the petition to have the peak named in Theodore's honor. It's actually not a straightforward process to get a stream or lake, trail, or mountain renamed. It's all governed by the Canadian Geographical Names Board, an organization that was formed in 1897. Having a national agency to manage geographic names was recognized as a necessity shortly after Confederation in the late 1800s. With the frontiers of European immigration and settlement spreading across the land, it was critical that there was one organization in charge of recording, and if necessary, deciding official names and spellings of place names. In this year, 2022, it celebrates its 125th anniversary, and since its inception, has approved over 125,000 place names. Right, so as I mentioned, Theodore Fricker was a hunting guide, and he hunted moose and helped other people hunt moose. Now, you can just imagine what it would be like carrying all your hunting gear up and down these mountains. But not only that, then when you get the moose, you have to carry the moose out. And you do have to carry it out because this is Zone 5 for moose hunting, and in Zone 5, ATVs are not allowed. There are some mapped trails through the area specifically for hunting moose, many of which include easements over private land and are only used for moose hunting. They bypass the worst of the grade, but in the highlands you aren't going to avoid all hills. The terrain here, as you can tell, is challenging at times. Add to that no access for ATVs for hunting, and you have a lot of work ahead of you to pack out harvested animals. This area is on the edge of the Pollett's Cove Aspy Fault Wilderness area. Pollett's Cove is on the other side of the highlands, and below me, Aspy Bay, beyond Dingwall and North Harbour Beach. The wilderness area was designated in 1999 and expanded in 2015. There are a lot of plans for this area, including trails for hiking and the development of mountain bike trails on the slopes facing the bay. As I said, it gets steeper and steeper and steeper. Well, the last bit of that climb was something, wasn't it? Lots of loose rock, very slippery. I wouldn't want to do that on a wet day. But 557 feet from the forest floor, and I've made it to the top. You know, behind me is actually the highest point on this mountain, but it's not where everybody goes. Everybody heads out the other peak where the lookoff is. What a view. You know, this is what makes the hike so worth it. And it is not an easy hike to get up here. But below me, the North Harbour Islands, North Harbour itself, of course, North Harbour Beach stretching across, and beyond that, Aspy Bay. This is a challenge, but you know, that's part of what makes this hike worthwhile. T.S. Eliot once said, "Only those who risk going too far will find out how far they can go." Well, in your next walkabout, I hope you challenge yourself and see just how far you can go.
Hey, come on, feel the sunshine. Oh, come on, won't you be mine? Hey, come on, feel the sunshine. Oh, come on, won't you be mine? Oh, hey, oh, hey, feel the sunshine. Oh, hey, oh, hey, oh, hey, feel the sunshine. Hey, come on, feel the sunshine.